Good morning. Welcome everyone to this webinar on the upcoming American Anthropological Association vote to boycott Israeli academic institutions. I am Jessica Winiger. I teach anthropology at Northwestern University. I'll be moderating this webinar. We have three faculty who will be giving presentations and answering questions about the upcoming AAA vote to boycott. We have Lisa Rofel from the University of California at Santa Cruz, Alana Feldman from George Washington University, and Nadia Abulhaj from Barnard and Columbia University. Professor Haj is also the co-director of the Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia University. So first we will have presentations by each of our scholars on the panel. The first presentation by Alana Feldman will be why a boycott of Israeli institutions, discussing the reasons behind the boycott. The second speaker, Lisa Rofel, will be speaking about what a boycott does and what it doesn't do. And the third speaker, Nadia Abulhaj, will be discussing anthropological and archaeological issues related to the boycott in particular, as well as academic freedom issues. We will leave ample time for questions during this broadcast. As a reminder, this is a live broadcast, and an annotated recording of the broadcast with links to any reference documents will be available in the next day or so on the Anthro Boycott YouTube page. During this broadcast, you can submit your questions by tweeting at @anthroboycott or by emailing anthroboycott@gmail.com. You can also submit a question via message at our Facebook page. So we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as possible after the presentations within our time constraints. I'd like to remind everyone of our different social media sites at anthroboycott.wordpress.com, our Facebook page, Anthropologists for Justice in Palestine, and our Twitter account at AnthroBoycott. As a beginning reminder, the vote at the American Anthropological Association on the proposal to boycott Israeli academic institutions opens on April 15th. So we are about 6 weeks ahead of that vote, and that is why we decided to have this informational webinar. So our first speaker is Alana Feldman from George Washington University, and she will be discussing the question, why a boycott of Israeli institutions? Professor Feldman.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for tuning into this. This resolution comes before us after a long period of discussion and deliberation within the association, and after the publication of the report of the AAA Task Force on Israel and Palestine, which documents the tremendous violations of Palestinian rights by Israel, and which unanimously recommends that we take substantive action in support of Palestinian rights. The overwhelming support for the boycott resolution at the AAA meetings in November was a product of this process. It was a terrific night for anthropology, and I'm confident that as we go into this ratifying vote, the full membership of the association will support the boycott call. Now, the boycott resolution responds to a call by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, and from the full swath of Palestinian universities, professors, and students that asks us to participate in an international boycott campaign in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom. So a AAA boycott is first and foremost an action in solidarity with Palestinian society broadly and with our colleagues in Palestinian universities specifically. The boycott campaign within the AAA developed as part of this wider BDS movement in recognition of two related things. First, Israeli violation of Palestinian rights. Israel's oppressive policies toward Palestinians under occupation, discrimination against Palestinian citizens of the country, and denial of the rights of Palestinians displaced in 1948 and 1967 not only continue, but have become more extreme in recent years. As an occupying power, Israel has responsibility to protect the lives and rights of Palestinians under occupation. Instead, it has pursued a vigorous policy of settlement building in Palestinian territory, expanded significantly after the 1993 signing of the Oslo Accords that many hoped would lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. It has progressively limited Palestinian movement and denied Palestinians access to each other. In Gaza, it has imposed a blockade that is designed to keep the population suspended on the edge of a humanitarian crisis. And in summer 2014, it launched its third assault on Gaza in 7 years, killing over 2,000 people, largely civilians. Israel's academic institutions are directly and materially involved in the occupation. Virtually all Israeli institutions are involved in defense-related research with the Ministry of Defense. Ben Gurion University, Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, and Haifa University all made explicit statements of support for the summer 2014 assault on Gaza, including providing financial benefits to soldiers. Universities have been part of the colonization of Palestinian territory. Part of Hebrew University's campus is built on confiscated Palestinian land. Ariel University, the most recently accredited Israeli university, is located in a West Bank settlement. And Israeli universities also discriminate against Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. Some 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian, yet they make up only a tiny percentage of university faculty. These scholars face barriers to promotion, especially if they're known as critics of the government. And Palestinian students in Israeli universities have less access than their Jewish counterparts to scholarship and campus housing. Their freedom of political and cultural expression is regularly curtailed. And Israeli Jewish faculty members openly critical of state policies are also marginalized and threatened. No Israeli university has taken a stand against the occupation or for equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Efforts to change these conditions within the framework of the so-called peace process and under the banner of dialogue have failed miserably. The BDS call recognizes the urgent need for new political strategies. The BDS call also recognizes U.S. complicity. The United States, and therefore American citizens, are deeply complicit in Israel's violations of Palestinian rights because of the enormous sum of money that our government provides Israel every year, and because of the nearly unwavering support it gives Israel in international forums. One of the issues that people consider when they think about their own political engagement is whether our first effort should be targeted towards problems at home, our government's policies and actions, or abroad, taking a stance with other people's struggles. An important aspect of BDS is that it does both at once. It speaks to the U.S. government and says that we, the citizenry, do not accept the status quo and that we are working to change U.S. practices towards Israel from the grassroots. And in addition, it speaks to an Israeli public and asks them to do the same. Israeli oppression of Palestinians is not only a foreign policy matter, but a domestic U.S. matter. If we choose not to take action to oppose it, we in fact endorse it. As an American association with membership drawn largely from people in U.S.-based institutions, the AAA has an responsibility to engage on this issue. And as anthropologists with long-standing commitments to human rights and to standing with oppressed peoples, we feel compelled to act on this matter. The conclusions of the extensive research by the task force were, and I quote the report, "We are of the unanimous opinion that, in terms of the principles outlined above, there is a strong case for the association to take action on this issue and that the association should do so." The report is extensive and powerful in its account of Israeli violations of Palestinian academic freedom and rights more broadly. Of special relevance to anthropologists, it notes that, quote, "Archaeology is being used in very distinct ways to change the physical landscape and to authorize particular histories while denying others in a manner that extends the reach of the Israeli occupation. So it is time now for anthropologists to stand up for the Palestinian right to education, social justice, and freedom." The following speakers will provide more details about how the academic boycott will work. I want to say something now more generally about what sort of action a boycott is. Crucially, a boycott is a tactic in a wider political struggle. It is not simply a statement of moral or political disapproval. It is not the means to end the occupation, but one admittedly small plank in a broader array of political efforts. The fact that Israel is a democracy for its Jewish citizens who have chosen their government and dictate its policies make boycott an effective tactic for this situation. Questions about why boycott Israel and not North Korea or China seem to entirely miss the point that boycott is a political act and not just a statement of position. In voting for boycott, we have the opportunity to join a movement that is already strong and is getting stronger. We have an opportunity to pursue tactics that are appropriate for our location, an academic organization enacting academic boycott, whose effects are amplified by being part of an array of other located tactics. And in so doing, we have an opportunity to engage Palestinians as our colleagues and compatriots, rather than as supplicants in need of our charity. So please make sure that your AAA membership is up to date and vote for the resolution from April 15th to May 31st. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana Feldman at George Washington University. If you're joining us late, this is the webinar on the upcoming American Anthropological Association vote to boycott Israeli academic institutions. As a note, this is a live broadcast, but an annotated version of this broadcast with links to any reference documents will be available in the next day or so on the Anthro Boycott YouTube page. We are still accepting questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar. You can submit your questions throughout this broadcast by tweeting at AnthroBoycott or emailing anthroboycott@gmail.com or sending a message through our Facebook page, Anthropologists for Justice in Palestine. Again, this is a discussion of the vote to boycott Israeli academic institutions. Ballots open at the AAA on April 15th and are open until May 31st. Our next speaker is Professor Lisa Rofel, who teaches anthropology at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and she will be speaking on the topic, what a boycott does and doesn't do. Professor Rofel.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to begin by distinguishing between the Anthropology Association's boycott resolution and a boycott by individual anthropologists who might want to conduct the boycott in their individual professional lives. This boycott resolution that is being voted on within the Anthropology Association starting April 15th is a boycott of institutions. It is not a boycott of individuals, nor is it a requirement for individual anthropologists to engage in boycott in their own professional lives, except insofar as they individually choose to do so. The Anthropology Association boycott resolution means that the Anthropology Association will not develop collaborative relationships with Israeli academic institutions. It means that those Israeli academic institutions would not be able to engage in certain activities as institutions in relation to the Anthropology Association. Those activities would include being listed in the Anthro Guide, advertising in the Anthropology Association venues, or participating in the Anthropology Association's Departmental Services Program, the Career Center, or the Graduate School Fair. In addition, the boycott would preclude granting permission to copy and reprint articles from the Anthropology Association publications to journals and publications based at Israeli institutions. The boycott may also preclude selling AnthroSource access to Israeli institutions. However, individual anthropology members from Israel will still have access to AnthroSource through their personal membership. I'd like to stress that the boycott is not a boycott of individuals. This boycott will not prevent Israeli scholars from coming to the Anthropology Association meetings, from publishing in U.S.-based journals, from coming to lecture or study in U.S. universities, so long as they do so not as official representatives of their institutions. This boycott resolution is distinct from what individual anthropologists might decide to do. Individual anthropologists might decide to take further actions in their own professional lives, such as not attending events or conferences officially sponsored by Israeli academic institutions. However, it is not a boycott even in that individual capacity of doing research in Israel or participating in conferences that are not being sponsored by Israeli academic institutions. But I want to stress again what I just said about the choices individual anthropologists might make is not part of this Anthropology Association resolution that is being voted on starting April 15th by the Anthropology Association membership. I want to reiterate what Ilana said. We have a responsibility as American anthropologists to take positive action in support of Palestinian rights to education. We have a responsibility to support Palestinians' full human and civil rights, including the right to self-determination, equal rights within Israel, and the return of refugees. We have a responsibility because the United States government makes this illegal and violent occupation possible. It makes it possible through both its military aid to Israel and its international protection of the Israeli government from international condemnation. It's precisely because the U.S. government has taken no action whatsoever and has continued to support the Israeli occupation that we as citizens need to take this boycott, to support this boycott resolution. Both the United States and the Israeli government have been moving towards increasing the occupation, increasing the illegal grabs of more and more Palestinian land in a dangerous fantasy of building a greater Israel. The boycott resolution is a very effective strategy. Even the discussion of it has begun to have important effects. For the first time in its history, the Israeli Anthropology Association issued a mild statement condemning the occupation. They refused, however, to honor this call for a nonviolent approach to recognizing Palestinians' full human and civil rights and ending, therefore, the occupation and the right of return of refugees. But the Israeli Anthropology Association has been compelled to respond precisely because discussion of boycott in fact creates the conditions for true dialogue. It's an incredibly effective strategy for, in fact, forcing the Israeli government to enter into dialogue and negotiations to end the occupation. Other Israelis also support the Palestinian call for boycott, and here I quote, "We wish to express our strong support of anthropologists everywhere who are taking part in the campaign, standing up to Israel's policies of settler colonialism, apartheid, and belligerent military occupation, and holding it accountable for its crimes," end quote. That's a quotation from Israeli anthropologists. The anthropology boycott resolution is effective because it is a non-violent means to get the Israeli government to reverse its present course of action. The Israeli government's response to the discussion of boycott, in fact, has been quite visible. And that makes it very clear that it's very effective. Of course, they are trying to get the United States government to pass laws making it illegal to discuss boycott, which it essentially now is within Israel. So the anthropologist's letter I just quoted has been written anonymously for that reason. The boycott resolution is effective in giving support to Palestinians who seek social justice and support for Palestinians seeking the right to education. This boycott is a demand for accountability. Taking a public stance in favor of this boycott is also a means for opening up a conversation about the United States' unwavering support of Israel's occupation. Since Israel claims to be a democracy, it is incumbent upon universities and their scholars to speak out against their government's decisions and actions that negatively affect the academic freedom and other rights of Palestinians living under their rule. Much of the Israeli Academy actively supports and materially and practically nurtures the military occupation. This boycott is an attempt to put pressure on those institutions and thus on the Israeli government to change its actions. From Cesar Chavez to South Africa, boycotts have been effective. They have been an effective, nonviolent means to get governments and corporations to change their policies and behavior. Sometimes it takes time, but this is the most hopeful strategy I have seen in a very long time that addresses the illegal Israeli occupation and that occupation's denial of Palestinian rights. It gives me great hope that I might even see an end to that occupation in my lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa Rolfel from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Welcome to our webinar on the upcoming AAA vote to boycott Israeli academic institutions. That upcoming vote begins on April 15th by electronic ballot from the AAA and will extend until the end of May. In this webinar, which is a live broadcast, we are welcoming questions in the Q&A period. To submit a question, please email us at anthroboycott@gmail.com. You can also tweet a question to @anthroboycott or submit a question through our Facebook page, Anthropologists for Justice in Palestine. If you're looking for more information on this campaign, you can also visit anthroboycott.wordpress.com. Our third speaker today is Professor Nadia Abou-Haj, who teaches anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University. She's also the co-director for the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. She will be speaking on anthropological and academic freedom issues related to the boycott. Professor Abou-Haj.
Thank you. Okay, first I'm going to discuss a few questions related to anthropology as a discipline and why I consider it our political and ethical obligation to take a stance here. First, let me talk about the role of archaeology within the context of Israel and Palestine. As you may know, I wrote my first book on the practice of archaeology in Israel, and the argument that runs throughout the book is really an argument of how it was that the discipline contributed to, in powerful and constitutive ways, to the repeated transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. But rather than revisit that long history in my argument here, I want to focus more specifically on the illegality of archaeological practice since 1967 over the Green Line, and the ways in which Israeli archaeologists continue to collude with the state's project of settlement. And when I say that, I mean both intentionally, but also mostly unintentionally. It's important to note before I begin that in Israel, archaeology is not a subfield of anthropology. Rather, it's its own discipline that is related far more closely to biblical studies and then to a lesser extent to classical studies and prehistory. Nevertheless, archaeologists around the world need to think about taking a stand vis-a-vis its role in the Israeli archaeologists' role in the ongoing expansion of Jewish settlement at the expense of Palestinian lands and homes. So archaeological excavations are illegal in occupied territories under two international statutes, the Fourth Geneva Convention and the 1954 Hague Convention. Excavations in occupied lands are considered theft of cultural property, and yet Israeli archaeologists, as well as their foreign colleagues, have carried out massive excavations since the 1967 war, in Gaza before the Israeli withdrawal, in East Jerusalem up until today, and throughout the West Bank. In order to get permission to excavate in the West Bank and Gaza in the following the 1967 war, archaeologists needed to go to the staff officer for archaeology in Judea and Samaria being the biblical terms for the West Bank. So I'm talking about the West Bank, but there was also a staff officer for Gaza, of the civil administration, that is, of the IDF. The civil administration was an arm of the Israel Defense Forces. And yet archaeologists, both from Israeli universities and from universities elsewhere, primarily in the US and Europe, applied for such permits and effectively carried out excavations under the authority of an occupying army. For excavations in East Jerusalem, permits were and are given by the Israel Antiquities Authority, even though East Jerusalem is an occupied territory under international law and not part of the Israeli state. So why might that matter? Besides the basic question of illegality, there are clear ethical and moral imperatives to avoid such excavations. Many have been used as a pretext for or resulted in land expropriation. They have been carried out on sites that became settlements, giving settlers both land once the land was confiscated, but also the ideological justification they needed for their commitment that this is ancient Jewish land to which they are merely returning as opposed to colonizing. To take one key and ongoing example in East Jerusalem today, the excavations at the site of the ancient city of David have been carried out in the Palestinian village of Silwan, which is part of East Jerusalem, under the authority of El-Aat, which is a settler organization committed to returning Jews to live on the site. And it is the Institute of Archaeology at Hebrew University that has carried out the excavations. as if they bear no responsibility for the political consequences of their work. As American anthropologists, that is, as members of a discipline that includes the subfield of archaeology, then, it's imperative for the AAA to take a stand. Again, yes, these are not anthropological archaeologists on the whole. Nevertheless, they partake in the same conferences and are members of many of the same organizations as are anthropological archaeologists. And data from Israeli sites is used by archaeologists worldwide. It is very important that we signal that this kind of research, which is sponsored by Israeli academic institutions, cannot go on as usual. It is not just unethical, it is illegal. Archaeology aside, however, there are also broader reasons to take a stand. The AAA represents our discipline in and to the world. And as someone who worked on the American Studies Association boycott put it recently, starting with our own academic institutions or associations is a way of starting at home. Those associations represent us. It is through them that we can speak and have a voice as a discipline. What we are asking of the AAA is to be clear that as an association that represents the profession of American anthropology, it does not think it is okay to continue or to develop relationships with Israeli academic institutions in a situation of crisis. So why then is this a situation of crisis to which academics, not just anthropologists, but all academics need to respond? I could revisit the entire question of the political crisis, but insofar as we speak through our professional organizations as academics, I want to focus on the crisis of Palestinian higher ed. One needs to keep in mind that the Israeli state is engaged in the systematic destruction of Palestinian education, from primary through universities, although here I will focus on the question of universities. It has gone on since the 1967 war, that educational institutions have been raided on a regular basis, but I'm going to focus on a more recent period. During the First Intifada, which began in 1987, the Israel Defense Forces closed schools and universities for long periods of time. Bir Zayt, one of the major Palestinian universities on the West Bank, for example, was closed for 3 years. This wasn't a security decision. It was a decision to deprive Palestinians of one of the basic building blocks of any society, that is, an educated citizenry. The ability for students and professors to continue their education, work, and research is unimpeded is virtually impossible today. Universities are raided by the Israeli military on a regular basis, and it's important to point out here that Palestinian universities in the West Bank are in Area A, which are supposed to be under Palestinian control, and yet the IDF enters them all the time. Closures and checkpoints across the West Bank make it impossible for people to make it to school and work. The Islamic University in Gaza was targeted during the most recent invasion, destroying much of its infrastructure. For that matter, Gaza students cannot attend universities in the West Bank. They can't get permits from the Israeli authorities to do so. Palestinian students and professors who get fellowships or other kinds of invitations to speak or study abroad are often denied exit permits, and there are severe restrictions on foreign professors who want to teach at Palestinian universities. Permits are not given by the Israeli government, and many people who try to go in are turned around at the airport at the moment of entry. One more point worth mentioning. Israel controls the shipment of all books into the West Bank and clearly into Gaza insofar as they control all border points unless it comes through Egypt, and they don't permit many of them through, especially books from major Arabic publishing houses in Lebanon and in Egypt, for example. And in the face of all those restrictions on Palestinian education, Israeli universities remain silent. Or more accurately, they have remained silent at best. At worst, and very commonly, they have come out in explicit support of Israeli state policies, such as in support of the war on Gaza in 2014, which Alana mentioned. Yes, not all professors at Israeli universities remain silent, although it's worth mentioning that most do, but their institutions have remained silent and have been at best and have been explicitly supportive at worst. And it is their institutions, not them as individual scholars, that we are calling upon the AAA to boycott. So can the AAA take such a stand? Are we asking the association to enter into the realm of politics, which is not its role, which is one of the questions or pushbacks we have gotten? Given the history of the AAA, That seems an untrue claim prima facie. The AAA has taken political stances in the past, and more specifically, it has called for boycotts in particular situations. I will give a few examples. The AAA has issued statements and letters in support of the rights of indigenous peoples in Guatemala and Brazil. It has expressed concern about the deaths of Mexican students, and it has issued statements calling for archaeological and cultural heritage preservation in Egypt, Iraq, Belize, and Mali, and most recently, it has made such statements vis-a-vis ISIS's destruction of archaeological sites in Syria. The AAA has expressed its opposition to the human terrain system that recruited anthropologists as part of the counterinsurgency strategy of the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it has, in the past, although rarely, condemned Israeli actions. There was a 1982 statement on Lebanon, in other words, a statement that criticized the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and a statement also in 1982 on academic freedom in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, clearly the lack of it. More specific to the call that we're making here, the AAA has endorsed boycotts. It endorsed a boycott of the Hilton and Hyatt hotels for their labor practices. It has endorsed a boycott of the states of Arizona and Illinois, and any state or municipality whose laws discriminate against LGBTQ people. In other words, to argue that the AAA cannot take a stance because it cannot take a political position, because to do so would violate its basic principles and implode or delegitimize the organization, is to ignore its own history. It has taken political positions in the past. The AAA has supported boycotts. The question then here is not a procedural one. It is a substantive one. Should the AAA take a stand on this particular political question? Clearly, I think that we should. Voting to boycott Israeli academic institutions, as Alana, I think, has laid out very eloquently, is simultaneously a critique of the Israeli state and a critique of our own. It is an acknowledgement simultaneously of the responsibility of the Israeli public for the Israeli state's violence and forms of discrimination, and it is a call to responsibility or recognition of the responsibility of an American public for our own state, which enables Israel to act as it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nadia Abel-Haj. I am Jessica Winiger from Northwestern University, and I'll be running moderating the Q&A section of this webinar on the American Anthropological Association's vote to boycott Israeli academic institutions. The vote begins on April 15th by electronic ballot and will be open till the end of May. For more resources on this vote, you can visit our website at anthroboycott.wordpress.com. And if you'd like to submit a question for the group right now, please do so by tweeting at anthroboycott. You could also email the question to anthroboycott@gmail.com. So we've gotten a range of really interesting and productive questions for our panel today. I'll start with the first one, and I'll direct it to Alana Feldman. One of the people watching the webinar is asking us, will a boycott violate our commitment to academic freedom?
Okay, thank you. The question of academic freedom is obviously directly relevant to us as an academic institution. But in thinking about the consequences of a boycott for academic freedom, what I want to start with is it's the recognition that the boycott is first and foremost a positive action in defense of Palestinian academic freedom. As Nadia just detailed, Palestinian academic freedom is not only violated and curtailed by Israel, but at times nearly utterly disrupted by Israel. So we're starting with a situation in which Palestinians do not have academic freedom. They do not have unfettered access to educational institutions. They do not have free access to educational and research materials. They do not have free and unfettered access to an international network of scholars and teachers, and they do not have free and unfettered access to each other as a network of scholars and teachers. So the most important thing for us to do in response to a situation where academic freedom is utterly violated is to try to impact that, to try to support Palestinian academic freedom. So the boycott, first and foremost, does that. It stands for Palestinian academic freedom. Now, in terms of the question of the impact of a boycott such as this on Israeli academic freedom, it does not violate Israeli academic freedom. The boycott is as has been noted multiple times, it is a boycott of institutions and not individuals. No individual Israeli scholar, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, will be barred from pursuing their research, from engaging in international collaboration, from learning and teaching to the best of their ability. What will change is the conditions in which that happens. And the boycott is meant to change the conditions in which people pursue their learning and research, because it is meant to speak to Israelis and to point out to them that there are consequences to the actions of their state, which is actions that they have supported. And so the boycott changes the circumstances of academic life for Israelis, but it does not violate Israeli academic freedom. And as I started by saying, the most significant thing is that it supports Palestinian academic freedom.
Thank you. The next question for Lisa Rofel that's coming to us is, didn't we already approve the boycott resolution? Why do we need this vote?
The Anthropology Association, because it's a very democratic association, feels that we should not allow resolutions to have their final status at the anthropology meetings. Some people cannot afford to come to the anthropology meetings, or for whatever reason cannot be at the anthropology meetings where these resolutions are voted on. All resolutions that are voted on at the business meeting of the Anthropology Association annual meetings have to then be sent to the full membership via electronic voting. Some of you who've been members for some time no doubt have received in the past emails urging you to vote on various resolutions. This is in line with that practice. It's been a long-held democratic practice of the Anthropology Association. So the vote is being sent out to the full membership electronically and given 6 weeks to vote starting April 15th. So please let everyone know, because I think some people believe that the resolution has been already decided and voted on once and are surprised when they hear that they need to vote on it again. Everyone who has voted on it at the Anthropology's annual meetings needs to vote again electronically. So please do keep up your membership and please do vote.
Great, thank you. The next question for Nadia Abou-Haj is from a listener that says, I'm invested in anthropology having an increasingly high profile and a prominent place in public discourse. I am worried that this will delegitimize anthropology in the public sphere. Can you address my concerns?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I want to point out that that has been a worry amongst other members of other academic associations that debated the boycott. And I want to take first just by answering in terms of the association, then answer it more broadly. The American Studies Association, the argument was that it would delegitimize it, would implode the organization, many people would leave. And in fact, what happened after the ASA passed the boycott was a massive increase in both membership and funds in support of the association. So in terms of a wide scholarly community, in many ways it signaled, it received a very positive response for having taken such a clear political and ethical stand. And what I would say in terms of a broader public, I think it's important to keep in mind that what academics are accused of all the time in this country, and especially with the increasing rise of the right, is that we live in our little ivory tower that has no relationship to the world. But the reality is, I think this is a moment where we're being called upon to actually take a political stand that is not limited, to take a political stand that reaches well beyond our narrow sort of interests or our particular intellectual scholarship, and to follow in the footsteps of other academic associations who've been at the forefront of this movement, which is really gaining steam. So in some sense, I think it's actually an act of legitimation. I mean, many people may not agree, but it is clearly an act that says that we really care about the world in which we live, that as American citizens we have to take responsibility for the actions and material support our state to give to the state of Israel, and that we have a responsibility that reaches beyond the narrow confines of our universities. So I would see it somewhat differently. I also want to just take a second to just tag on a little bit to Ilana's question about academic freedom and just point out that when BDS, the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, framed the terms of the academic boycott, they were very clear and very careful to protect academic freedom, in contrast, in fact, to the way that the boycott against South Africa was framed. And many of us supported that boycott, because in that instance there was in fact no protection for individual scholars. So in some sense this was a lesson in response to some of the criticism that emerged in the post-apartheid era about the structure of the anti-apartheid cultural and academic boycott. And so all the parameters that Ilana laid out were developed over time, over a few years in conversations with people who wanted to be clear that the academic freedom of individual Israeli scholars was protected. Thank you.
Great. Our next question I'm going to address to Lisa Rolfel, and we've had a couple of questions in this regard, so I'm going to group them together. And that is a question about potential legal repercussions on the AAA if it adopts this boycott. So the question is, has the AAA been subject to any lawsuit threats? What is likely to happen if the resolution passes? Does it open the association to lawsuits? And more broadly, are there worries that the association might split?
Thank you for that question. That's a very fair question. Again, just as Nadia did, we can go by the experience of the American Studies Association. In the case of the American Studies Association, several state legislatures, they did not bring a lawsuit against the association, but they, you know, politicians postured a lot about refusing to allow state funds to be used by faculty and students to go to the annual meeting of the American Studies Association. Actually, those that did not actually come to pass, but there have been no lawsuits, and there would be no grounds for a lawsuit. So I think the worst that we could see is this kind of politicians posturing that would try to deny the use of state funds to attend the annual meetings. That would be probably the most extreme response we would see.
Ilana Feldman?
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the organization Palestine Legal is a good resource for people to look at if you're sort of concerned about what is in fact the legal landscape in relation to things like boycott. There's a certain amount of effort from opponents of the boycott to try to scaremonger around the question of legal implications of a boycott and whether there is a legal problem. There is not. As an academic association, we have the rights and capacity to determine the actions of our association in this regard and others. So while there may be effort to make noise about it, we do not face a legal challenge.
Great. The next question I'd actually like to have you also address, Ilana, and that is the question of why boycott institutions in Israel that the writer says are most likely to, and in fact do, produce progressive dialogue. This would effectively shut down the opportunity to build allies in Israel that are opposed to settlements. Your response?
Okay, I think that there are a few things we need to address in a question like that. One is the underlying presumption that Israeli universities are, by and large, bastions of activity on behalf of anti-occupation activities or in favor of Palestinian rights. That just simply is not the landscape of Israeli universities by and large, which again is not to say that there are not people in those institutions that are pursuing such activities. But in terms of the question of actual dialogue, right? If dialogue is the question, you need to have a dialogue with somebody. And Israeli institutions are not spaces where Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza can participate in a dialogue. Not only is there a tremendous inequity in circumstances, Palestinians simply cannot get there. So Israeli universities, under current circumstances, cannot be the space for a dialogue among the parties and the populations that live there. In fact, by engaging in an academic boycott that interferes in the status quo, that says you cannot even think about proceeding as things are now, we create opportunities for genuine conversation and dialogue. There is nothing about boycott politics or boycott as a tactic that seeks to undermine the capacity, any kind of productive capacity of people to engage with each other. In fact, what it does is open up those possibilities. And Israeli academics who support Palestinian rights, who are opposed to the occupation, should welcome this opportunity to engage in a politics that will be productive, that is responsive to the call of the people who are suffering from these policies. We and they should take their cue from Palestinians rather than feeling a need to organize and dictate how conversation would take place. And boycott supports all of that.
Nadia Belhaj, I have a two-pronged question for you, coming from two different people, but I think that they're linked. One is, they would like you to give an example of the kinds of collaborations between the AAA and the Israeli universities that the boycott would disallow. And the second question on the Palestinian side is, isn't just this boycott vote symbolic? Will it really have any impact on the movement for Palestinian rights? What kinds of ramifications do you predict that this vote would really have on the ground?
Okay, thank you. So the reality is that the American Anthropological Association does not have a lot of institutional ties to Israeli universities. So in part, the boycott is a call to not develop them. But there are some specific ramifications, which are limited. So let me start with saying what they're not. It does not mean that Israeli professors and students cannot attend AAA conferences, cannot be a member of the AAA, et cetera, et cetera. It does mean that Israeli anthropology departments cannot be listed in the AAA guide. They cannot use the services for search for faculty searches that the AAA provides. It does mean that articles who the AAA owns the copyright for the journals such as American Ethnologists or American Anthropological Association cannot be reproduced with permission in Israeli journals. And it might mean, as I think Lisa mentioned before, that Israeli academic institutions cannot subscribe to AnthroSource, although individual academics can. Having said that, the boycott vote is the first step, and then the AAA would have to make a decision about what they would want to implement. Because one thing that the BDS is very clear about is that the boycott should be implemented in terms that make sense to the institution implementing them. In other words, there is some leeway in terms of interpreting what exactly cutting institutional ties means. But those are some of the broad parameters. If the AAA had money invested, it would have to, one of the things would be divesting it from Israeli academic institutions, but it doesn't have any money. Is the boycott merely symbolic? The boycott, I think the academic and cultural boycotts, and this was true in South Africa too, particularly the sports boycott, in many ways it is a symbolic boycott. However, and I think this is really important, we're anthropologists. I think we have to think seriously about the symbolic not being tethered to the word merely. The reality is that the boycott has opened, I think Lisa mentioned this, has opened more conversation and debate about the state of Israel-Palestine today in U.S. society than I have seen since I moved here about 25 years ago. It has that force. It has the force of saying there is something not okay going on here. We need to recognize it, we need to talk about it, and we need to force the U.S. government and public to do something about it. So on that level, it is symbolic, but the symbolic has material force here. If we, as an organization, had investments in Israeli academic institutions, then of course it would be a call for divestment. But much of the material effect is quite limited, whereas the symbolic effect is being part of a growing movement saying, we need to recognize that things in Israel cannot go on as if they're normal. And the other thing that I would say is, besides opening up a general conversation about Israel and Palestine in the public domain, I see sort of a call for boycott as the beginning of a wedge into the broader BDS movement, which is a call for divestment, which has economic divestment has gotten a lot more. It certainly has begun to grow in the U.S. The U.S. Presbyterian Church, for example, has divested from at least companies that support the occupation or profit from the occupation, but it has not gotten as much traction here as in Europe. And the academic boycott seems to me a key way to begin to wedge open that possibility in the U.S. public domain.
Excellent. We have about 7 minutes left, and I'd like to address two questions, or one question, and then end on sort of what sympathetic listeners could do to help the boycott. And so this final question is one that keeps coming up frequently in conversations, and so I'd like Lisa Rofel to address it. And this is a question about why take a stand on this issue and not on myriad other issues. And what frequently gets mentioned in such questions are things such as honor killings, female genital cutting, what's going on in Syria, Russia, etc., or the Republican Party and its bigotry. So the question of why this issue in particular and not other issues. Lisa.
Thank you for that question. That's a very important question. First, I want to emphasize that talking about and acting on trying to end the illegal Israeli occupation does not preclude acting on all these other issues that were mentioned. I was very active in all the feminist debates about genital, some people called it genital mutilation, others called it clitoridectomy. We had lots of feminist debates about that, and what was very productive about those debates in the past is what stance feminists in the United States should take that would not reproduce kind of colonial condescension and a sense that we should dominate how that issue should be addressed. That leads me into the second point, which is this is a response to a call from over 170 Palestinian civil society groups. We are responding to a call from Palestinians to act in support of their search for social justice and their rights. And when we get calls from other places, we do respond. I was also active in the past on the responses from Central America when the United States was supporting military dictatorships there. We responded to the call from civil society groups in Central America to oppose our government's support of these military dictatorships. Lots of people are working on the Syrian refugee problem. Working on one issue does not preclude working on the other. Also, I should emphasize finally that boycott is a tactic. It is extremely effective in some situations and would not make sense in other situations. As a tactic, Israel, especially from the United States, I think it's particularly effective in relation to the Israeli occupation because the United States government gives so much military aid to Israel, more than to any other country, so much military aid that it enables the occupation. Without that military aid, the occupation would not be able to continue. So we have a responsibility as citizens or as living in the United States to respond to this call for boycott. This is an internal call to the Israeli occupation. If other people want to point out if there are internal calls in other places in the world for boycott in particular, then we would be having a discussion about those calls. Other places in the world do not call for boycott. They call for other strategies because they believe that boycott might not be the most effective tactic in response to the situation they're facing, but they do call for other kinds of responses. Thank you.
So to conclude this webinar, we would like to give our listeners and viewers some ideas for how to further support the boycott vote. So Alana Feldman, could you speak to some of the ways in which our supporters might help these efforts to get out the vote that opens on April 15th?
I would say first thing, talk to your friends and colleagues. Make sure that the people in your world, one, know that the vote is happening, are aware that we have not already concluded this vote. Make sure that their memberships are up to date, and make sure they voted. Share the materials from the Anthro Boycott website. There's lots of materials available. If people that you know have questions about aspects of the boycott, this webinar will be available, but there are lots of written materials that you can share with people. But I think the most important thing is to engage in continuous conversation to make sure that people are voting.
Nadia, do you have anything to add?
I think Alana sort of summed it up. Yeah, I think a lot of, just to emphasize, I think, well, first of all, I think a lot of us never vote in these electronic ballots because they come through our inboxes and get lost, but it's really important to pay attention and to vote on this. I think it's really important not to assume that because we won by such a huge margin in the actual meetings that we might not need to vote because it won't matter. We don't know, right? We really need everybody to vote, because it's hard to know what exactly the outcome is going to be, especially since it's hard to know how many people will vote. And I think it is just really important to try to deflect some of the arguments about the boycott. I mean, not deflect, but to respond continuously to the two most central charges about the boycott, which is one, why is one making an exception of Israel? I think Lisa just gave an incredibly powerful answer to that. And two, that we are going to isolate our Israeli colleagues, which is just patently untrue. Thank you.
Lisa?
Yes, I just wanted to add that you could encourage your colleagues to collectively watch this webinar, and also we are available for further teach-ins. And so if you would like people to come to your department and further discuss this boycott resolution vote, we have people who would be available to do that.
Excellent, great. So as a reminder, the vote is from April 15th to May 31st by e-ballot from the AAA. For more information, please visit our website, anthroboycott.wordpress.com. Please also join us on social media, our Facebook page, Anthropologists for Justice in Palestine, which has many, many updates, not just about this campaign, but of violations of Palestinian academic freedom and the complicity of Israeli academic institutions in the oppression of Palestinians. If you tweet, we are on Twitter at @AnthroBoycott. Thank you very much for watching this webinar, and please go out and vote starting April 15th.